Greetings, I'm Shad, and I like many things about the medieval period. I love swords, I love knights, I love castles, and I'm not the only one who likes this stuff about the medieval period. There's a lot of people who really like this, well, it's not a genre, it's a historical period, but as an extension to liking things of that period, we like stuff that uses it. So medias, where like movies, TV shows, video games, novels, because we like knights, castles, swords, whatever. And we even like mythological aspects that were prominent or came around during that period, like dragons, goblins and monsters, witches and other things. And thus the genres of the medieval historical movies, fiction, and medieval fantasy has become quite popular. Medieval fantasy seems to be a bit more popular than the medieval fictions that are based in historical time periods, historical events, historical peoples like the Tudors and other things like that. We see the more popular ones are things like Game of Thrones, video games like World of Warcraft, Dark Souls and such. Yes, indeed, the medieval fantasy is quite popular. But unfortunately, both these things, both the medieval fiction and the medieval fantasy, they sometimes do not portray the medieval period with any level of respect or justice. Shame on them. I spit on their inaccurate portrayals. If they're gonna base a movie, a TV show, a novel, or a video game in a period of history, not in, around, or using it as a world base for a fictional world, or whatever. But if they're doing that, they should at least show a bit of respect, do some justice to that period that they are using. Now, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, which is a pity, because they undermine, it harms their product. Whatever the media it happens to be, it doesn't become nearly as good as it could have been if they showed that respect. And what do I mean about respect? Well, accurate portrayal of things. What things? Well, the clothing they used, the armor they wore, the weapons they wielded, the castles they lived in, the social way people lived and behaved. The more accurate these products can be to what was actually done in the medieval period, the more realistic and immersive it will be. Because that's what we want. We want to be immersed. Don't you love a movie that you're just engrossed in, where the world around you, your life is just forgotten and you're just in that world, the characters, the adventure? That's awesome. What isn't awesome is when there's something in it that slaps you in the face and breaks that immersion, that engrossment. And unfortunately, things that are not realistic does that quite a lot. More so to people who know more about that period. But, yeah, there is another thing associated with this that is not necessarily related to helping out their product, but it's to help out the impact their products will do. You see, when someone portrays a medieval period, they will be, whether they like it or not, educate people who don't know much about that period, especially the historical fictions that are based on actual events. If they are not portrayed correctly, if the things are just done incorrectly, people who don't know anything about it actually will come out of whatever it was, okay, movie, TV show, video, and whatever, thinking that that's the way it was done, that's the way it looked, and that's the way it was. How many people who have watched Braveheart think that William Wallace actually used a two-handed sword after they've watched it? How many think that the Battle of Stirling, as it was called in the movie, was won with pikes, sharpened sticks, and not by the bottleneck that William Wallace and his men forced the English onto, on the bridge. He bottlenecked the English on the bridge and fought them on the bridge, and that's how he won it, and it was actually called the Battle of Stirling Bridge. See the misinformation that's being conveyed in a poorly historically based movie? And what's even worse about this is that it's still a really good movie. Like Braveheart, it's pretty awesome, alright? The unfortunate thing is that because it's portrayed that period, that event, there's portrayals in it that are completely inaccurate, people will become misinformed about that era, that event. And the greater tragedy about this is that the movie wouldn't have really been harmed if they corrected those mistakes. Braveheart would still be just as awesome as it was, alright? The movie makers don't seem to think that, but I feel it would be, okay? If they showed the savviness that William Wallace, actually had in bottlenecking the English on Stirling Bridge to defeat them, I mean, it wouldn't have been as big a battle, but it would have shown intelligence. It would have had a different effect, but in my opinion, just as good an effect. And also, weapons and shields. I mean, there's no actual thing saying William Wallace used a sword, but okay, let's say sword and shield, because sword and shield is far more accurate than the big two-hander he's using in the movie. That's just as awesome. Swinging around on a sword and shield, that can be awesome, okay? But they gave him a two-handed sword. And if anyone goes to say that the William Wallace sword is in the museum, whatever, and it is two-handed, do your research, please. You can just Wikipedia it, and you will find the facts in regards to that. So, accuracy of time periods. Two effects that I see. One, if it's accurate, it can create immersion and draw us in, and we'll simply enjoy it more. And two, if it also shows, if it's inaccurate, misinformation. Bad thing. Now you might say, this doesn't really apply as much to fantasy, medieval fantasy, because people go into it thinking that it's a medieval fantasy. I agree to an extent, but I still actually see people developing incorrect ideas about the medieval period from watching medieval fantasies. A good example of this is leather armor. How many people think leather armor is a proper historical thing? And okay, to some extent, it was. Maybe. There's debate on it. But it wasn't prominent. But most people think, especially people who play medieval fantasy video games and stuff like that, think that leather armor is a thing. And it was a prominent thing. It was one of the go-to types of armor people wore. Another example is the names of swords, okay? How many people think a longsword is a one-handed sword? This is again more predominantly thanks to medieval fantasy and the words used to describe the weapons as it is to the medieval fiction and historical fictions. So accuracy is still important to an extent, even if it's medieval fantasy. Now that's really my opinion in regards to, the more historical-based ones that are movies, TV shows, video games that are based in historical periods and events. But I have a bit more lenience when it comes to medieval fantasy, to some extent, because the examples I shared about the leather armor and the names of weapons and stuff, I feel they should be accurate, but I think there is room to move, okay? Because it is fantasy, and if the creators want to substitute something that was historically accurate with something else, I think they have the freedom to do it. Of course they have the freedom to do it. They have the freedom to do it anyway, but it could serve their product, okay, better if they are substituting it something that is more awesome, okay? We're talking about here the rule of cool, awesomeness. What a lot of people don't get is that oftentimes this substitute is not as cool or awesome as what was historical. Gambesons are just as cool as leather armor, and a leather armor that's just this dog's breakfast piece of mess looks absolute rubbish. It doesn't look that great, okay? And on top of that, it doesn't look functional or realistic, and so it's a poor substitute. Bad move, okay? It should be made as real. It can be unhistorical, yet still realistic. That's the first thing. So even if it's not historical, it can still be realistic. For instance, leather armor in the medieval period. Okay, let's at least try and make it realistic, like it looks like it would protect someone from a sword strike. And I find it difficult to see a suit of leather armor that didn't look realistic, but its awesomeness was so high that it still kind of justified the substitution. It's hard for me to see that. Weapon sizes and other things, that I reckon works pretty well. They're not realistic at all when you beef up a weapon that looks way bigger than anyone could actually lift in reality, but is awesome. And it portrays things about the characters. Heroic because it's so strong he can use a weapon that in reality no one could actually lift. And I know I'm using the example of Cloud's Buster Sword, and it's not actual medieval fantasy. It's just the most iconic large sword that anyone can see. Is it realistic? No, not at all. No one could actually lift that thing. Is it awesome? Yeah, it's pretty darn awesome. So in medieval fantasy, I have this opinion in regards to how much it should be accurate, medievally accurate, and how much you should allow, or how much leeway you should have for pure fantasy, whatever, in regards to the medieval elements, okay? So I'm not saying like in races and other things like that, but if you want it to seem medieval enough to the point where you're giving justice to the period that you're drawing from, the balance I feel is that around 80% medieval accurate makes it really cool, okay? Makes it authentic, it's immersive, it seems realistic. And even 90%, so 80 to 90%, and then say 20 to 10% room to move. But the substitutions should be cool, okay? It should be it should seem or be more awesome than the thing you're substituting it with. And if you can, on top of that, still try and make it realistic and medieval-ish. And this is kind of the balance I do with my own fiction. So with the books I try to write, with the role-playing settings I make for role-playing, tabletop pen and paper stuffs, and also my own artwork with the drawings I draw. That's kind of the balance I try and go for. Around 80%, 90% accurate, and then 10 to 20 room to move. And that can be whatever. If it's something that I just think makes the image or something, the whole thing cool or awesome, I'll do it. So weapon sizes, yeah, I'll go with a bigger weapon if it's more awesome. If they're not wearing full armor, well, the armor that they are wearing, I'll try and make look accurate enough. But if it looks better or it just seems cooler with some, tweaks here and there, I'll tweak it. And so in summary, I do feel we should expect, even though we rarely ever get it, some accuracy when it comes to medieval fiction. But allow some freedom when it comes to medieval fantasy, but hope they get the balance right. Because when the balance is right, oh my goodness, it's awesome. So cool. So awesome.